members of the Parliament, and all of you distinguished guests. The reason why we have decided to address tonight the impact of the recent economic elections is because Germany has become central to the future of the euro area, and it has evolved unwillingly into the hegemony. Its economic power, its status as the highest lender, and its perception as safe haven has increased its influence. The decision that it chooses to make or rejects greatly influence the European Union. And its government has veto power on the rescue packages. Lately, the signs of an economic recovery are appearing in the European Union, but there are still major risks and issues that must be addressed. At the level of the European Union, there are a few questions. Can the competitiveness adjustment be completed successfully and erase the risk of the sustainability of the public debt? Can the unfavorable financial conditions resulting from the fragmented and unstable banking industry be corrected? These are constraints for the growth and the job creation. Can the rise in unemployment, such a source of inequality and political instability, especially among the young, be reversed? We believe that Germany can assert its significant role in addressing these risks. But will Germany support a meaningful banking union with transferring of sovereignty to European institutions? Will the national economic policy of Germany be more supportive for the growth and adjustment with higher public investments in Germany consistent with the needs of the euro area as a whole? Is Germany going to promote private investment initiatives for Southern Europe and address the youth unemployment by financing new funds? All these decisions will greatly affect the South, and particularly Greece. The major challenge remains how we will be able to balance economic growth, structural reforms, and austerity measures. Tonight, His Excellency, the Ambassador of Germany, Wolfgang Dolt, with a deep knowledge of the European policies and Greek reality, will provide us with an introductory, insightful perspective. Then, the world-renowned economist and expert on growth, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, will give us his global perspective on what Europe should do. This raises the very important question: what is required so that Europe will stay as a relevant geopolitical power and maintain its current status in the next decade? Your Excellency.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much for allowing me to address this eminent audience. I am very much looking forward to tonight's debate and to Professor Jeffrey Sachs's lecture on Europe after German elections, the path back to economic growth. I have been kindly asked by you, Stelios, to add a German perspective on this subject. and I'll try to throw in a couple of short remarks. In last April, the Financial Times has reminded us of an old saying from Ronald Reagan. He said that the most terrifying words in the English language were, "Hi, I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Today, for some Europeans, the Financial Times pointed out, the terrifying words would be, "Hi, I'm from the EU and I'm here to bail you out." The remarkable article from the head of the German think tank DIW in Berlin, Mr. Marcel Fratscher, was titled, "Scapegoating the Germans is tempting, but wrong." I thought this could serve as a fitting opener for my remarks. I am constantly being asked whether I thought that the upcoming new German government would be more lenient towards Greece. This question is telling under several aspects. First, it's an indication about just how high expectations are of a new, somehow redeemed German role in the Eurozone in the aftermath of German elections. Second, it reveals a perception of German government policy as being more emotional than rational, or oscillating between magnanimous leniency and harsh educational punishments for misbehavior. Third, the question shovels the key to recovery to the German government, whilst at the same time easing the burden of responsibilities for one's own state of affairs. And last but not least, the question assumes that all power within the Eurozone lies in Berlin, despite the fact that the Eurozone partners all raise their hands in approval when decisions are being made, unanimity being required. For sure, I'm not going to describe the policy of a German government still in the early stage of creation. I don't think that this would go down very well at the headquarters back home. But I can point out a number of elements which, from my point of view, are likely to remain constants of German policy. First, yes, expectations towards Germany are high, and yes, Germany's present position of strength in Europe gives us special responsibility. Loads of articles are analyzing whether Germany has lived up to its responsibility, the definition of which varies depending on what exactly is expected from the individual perspective. And at the same time, the specter of a new German dominance is being projected on the wall. So it seems to be a thin line to walk on. This is an ongoing debate, of course not only outside of Germany, but within Germany as well. And let me add just two observations here. Even Germany has limited resources. Presently, almost a whole year's national budget is at stake if you add up all the recovery programs. You don't have to be a follower of the newly formed anti-Euro party in Germany to feel some unease about this, let alone the question of how much risk the German budget could possibly add to that. And you all know that the room of maneuver is limited with a debt ratio of 80%, which is also clearly overshooting the Maastricht criteria. Maybe the one or the other of you remember Maastricht criteria. The second observation is that Germany is deeply convinced that Europe will only have influence and authority in the world if it is united. These are defining years. The decision taken now will determine for years, perhaps even for decades, whether Europe will be a continent that declines or whether it will rise to the challenges of our time, particularly in relationship to the new centers of power in the world. With a share of world population of 7%, a share of world GDP of roughly 25%, the tendency going down, and a share of global expenditure for welfare, 50%, Europe should not imagine for 1 second that this can be sustained without a dramatic improvement in our competitiveness. Second, Yes, one might criticize the substance of the Eurozone decisions which led to establishing the recovery programs. And yes, there is no consensus amongst economists as to what level of debt harms growth and about the right timing of enhanced fiscal consolidation. The debate is legitimate, and I think we are all in a learning process. But German policy is not about punishing or rewarding behavior. I admit that reading some press clippings or some public declarations in Germany, you might get the impression that some people succumb to the temptation of seeing themselves in a position of superiority. But to believe that the German government is trying to be the European schoolmaster is grossly beside the point, and sometimes I find this rather populist assumption somewhat tiring. There's certainly no reason for us Germans to indulge in complacency. Competitiveness is not something you gain once and for all. It has to be defended on a daily basis. We have learned this at our own expense not too long ago. The truth is that Germany believes that growth and fiscal consolidations are not irreconcilable opposites. The recovery programs which were agreed upon are about growth through increased competitiveness and budget consolidation. German policy never ruled out, as a matter of principle, that government-financed stimulus can work. And you know that, for example, the concept of a public development bank is not alien to German economic thinking. Just observe the role the KfW has played in the years of reconstruction after the war. With this experience in mind, during his last stay in Athens in July this year, Minister of Finance Wolfgang Schäuble has committed himself to support the institution for growth with up to 100 million euro, hoping, of course, that other European partners would follow suit. Now, an institution for growth makes a lot of sense when it is embedded in a sound institutional framework, when the rules and structures of the institution are attractive enough to find the interest of investors. But public money will never be a substitute for private investments. So any recovery program must first and foremost be geared at regaining the confidence of the money market and of private investors through increased credibility and, again, competitiveness. That is why we believe that the right mixture of fiscal discipline and structural reform are the right recipe to get out of the crisis. And this is certainly not about punishing or rewarding. And I cannot help from pointing your attention to the fact that in order to ease the debt burden of Greece, the Eurogroup decided to refrain from keeping their earnings stemming from Greek government bonds. In the first half of 2013, Germany's share was around 600 million euro. A few days ago, the German Bundestag, after the elections, by the way, created the necessary budgetary basis for this money to be dispersed to Greece. Third, there's a tendency to deflect responsibility towards others. You could also call that scapegoating. In public debates here in this country, please allow me to be a little bit undiplomatic here, there still seems to be a scarcity of self-reflection on the causes of this debt crisis into which Greece slipped in. I was asked not too long ago by a journalist whether after the Bundestag elections, the German government would change its policy towards Greece, a policy which had plunged Greece in the crisis in the first place. A number of people including opinion makers, seem to think that Greece was a country which was doing fairly well, maybe had a little problem after the Lehman crisis, but then came the Troika and the real crisis started. I think it is important to remind ourselves regularly where we stood in this country in the beginning of 2010. The fact that Greece was unable to finance itself through the money market was due to the fact that investors just didn't believe that Greece would ever pay back its credits. The debt ratio had reached unsustainable proportions, and over the years, Greece had gradually lost productivity and competitiveness. At the European level, the decision was eventually taken to do an utmost effort to keep Greece, and in its wake other countries, within the Eurozone. That is when the recovery program was devised. I hate to repeat myself, but the recovery programs which since then are constantly being branded as austerity policy are twofold. The one side is about the fiscal consolidation, which means in very simple words, returning to sound fiscal policy, bringing expenditure and revenue in some kind of balance instead of constantly accumulating debts which following generations will have to pay back. The other side was, of course, structural reforms, or, as I prefer to say, modernization of the country. A credit program doesn't really make sense if it is not accompanied by a strict set of rules toward a structural overhaul. Modernizing Greece means restoring lost credibility and make the markets believe in Greece again. A lot has been done through hard work and some bitter loss of income for many in Greece. A lot is still on the agenda. A reform-oriented government is leading the way, but the modernization of Greece necessitates the support of the general public as well. The whole society has to take ownership of reforms. I still miss a broad-based debate about how this country should look like in 10 years from now. How the public wants public services to be run, be it the tax office or the public hospital. About what went wrong over the years that led the country into this crisis. Was it only about a sudden lack of cash, or were the reasons for the collapse more deeply rooted? Everybody has a role to contribute to this debate. To downsize the necessity of structural reforms and the need for fundamental change in the structures and procedures, however, would mean to miss a chance not only to bring back the country on the road towards recovery, but to make this recovery last for generations to come. Rather than scapegoating, governments need to convince their citizens that the fundamental restructuring is necessary. Economic growth will return to this country, but if growth meets a modernized and credible surrounding, it will last for generations to come. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude my remarks. The German Bundestag was elected 10 days ago, but the fundamentals of our view on how to remedy the crisis, how to restore the fatal loss of credibility and competitiveness, will remain more or less the same as they were before the Bundestag elections. I am convinced that we are right now witnesses of a recovery program for Greece, which is slowly increasing its grip on the crisis. The signs are there, things are moving, just compared to what we saw a year ago. There might be the necessity to further assist the Greek government and the Greek people, but this will only be a supplement to the efforts of the Greeks' own efforts. The path towards growth will be a Greek one. Thank you very much.
Your Excellency, thank you for your straightforward and to-the-point presentation. You spoke more like a statesman than a diplomat. We appreciate that. Jeffrey Sachs needs no introduction. He's a well-known economist, and we are honored that after advising His Whole Holiness the Pope in the Vatican, he came straight to Athens. So we hope he got a lot of divine inspiration so he can help us resolve our problems in Greece. Jeffrey Sachs, as you know, is the director of the Earth Institute, the professor of sustainable development at Columbia University, and he has been the world's leading expert on economic development and the fight against poverty and a leading advocate for economic equality even in the United States. His work on ending poverty, promoting economic growth, fighting hunger and disease, and promoting sustainable environmental practices has taken him to more than 125 countries, with more than 90 governments being advised on economic strategy in the Americas, Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Jeff, welcome.
Thank you. Stelios, thank you very, very much for hosting and arranging this wonderful session and this opportunity to meet together with you. And Ambassador, thank you very much for your remarks and for joining this program. Yes, I was at the Vatican yesterday, also in the midst of a number of religious leaders, so everyone was praying very hard. We did meet Pope Francis, and I hope something rubs off. And it reminds me, if I might, of what they used to say when I was advising the Polish government in 1989, which was a very dramatic moment. Communism was still in Eastern Europe, and Poland had become the first country to leave communism partly in semi-free elections in June 1989. And I became the advisor to the Solidarity movement. And of course, the situation was dramatic. There was hyperinflation, there was chaos, the economy was collapsing. And they used to say in Poland that there were two ways that Poland could recover: the normal way and the miraculous way. The normal way was that Jesus Christ would reappear on earth, declare the kingdom of heaven, solve the economic problems, and Poland would recover. The miraculous way is that Poland would get organized, go back to work, and make its economic reform. And actually, the miraculous way happened, as you know. Poland became the fastest growing country in Central and Eastern Europe. It got very good help from its neighbor Germany, which was very crucial. Chancellor Kohl, who I had the occasion to work with, who was a great leader, played a very important role. And many wonderful things happened. And I can tell you in 1989, and maybe it is a little bit relevant in terms of mood, serious people in Warsaw thought that Poland would be in civil war and in starvation within 12 months. They didn't envision that Poland would be on its way to economic growth that would last for a generation. So miracles can happen, and I count on a miracle happening in Greece also, because I think that Greece could see this moment as the nadir of this crisis and begin a recovery which is quite a significant one. I think most of you in the room have a major role to play in that recovery, whether as business leaders or as policymakers. And if you think for Greece's future and work together for Greece's future, I think you can do some very, very important things. This is, without question, an extraordinarily deep crisis, one of the deepest in modern history. What Greece has experienced is not normal, and it is not commensurate with Greek sins of any sort. It is a concatenation of events of many kinds that has led to a catastrophic outcome. Of course, output is down on official measurements by roughly a quarter. Unemployment is above 25%, which is a depression level. I think we need to be very clear that this is a staggering level of unemployment. And youth unemployment, which is the greatest tragedy of this country, is on official numbers about 2/3, or about 65%, just about the highest in the world. So I don't think that one can be complacent in any way about the current environment or treat it as business as usual. This is, by any standard, an extraordinary situation, and it requires absolutely extraordinary standards. It's Stelios asked me to talk about Europe's path back to economic growth, but I want to talk about Greece's path to economic growth. A little bit presumptuous, because I'm not, as you will know, immediately an expert on your economy, so I'm going to talk about some general principles, not about the specifics. If my general principles completely conflict with reality, then we'll find out, and I'll find out in a half an hour when we open for discussion. But I believe that the principles do apply as far as I know and understand of this economy, as I've been watching for many years and having the occasion to discuss with senior policymakers for a number of years, especially since the crisis began. So I don't want to talk about all of Europe. I want to talk about what Greece should do right now. Because you have choices, and the choices really transcend the issues of Berlin or the issues of Brussels. They are really, to a very important extent, your own choices. And I think the ambassador is right about that. Here are my starting assumptions. They're not necessarily happy ones, but I'm trying to be realistic. First, I do not think there will be any heroics in the Eurozone or new grand policies. The election in Germany is a status quo election, and it will be probably a grand coalition. It's not going to change anything very dramatic. And so I think one can count on a continuation of the basic orientation. That doesn't mean that the outcomes also continue on a downward slide. It just means that Greek policymakers and businesses have to confront, I would say, an environment internationally that looks pretty much the same as it did a month ago, 6 months ago, a year ago. I don't think that there will be any magic wand wave that it will decisively change conditions here. Second, I assume that Greece will remain in the euro and that the eurozone will survive. I think the worst risks of the eurozone coming apart have been passed now by especially the transition to Mario Draghi's policies, providing more credit, being more realistic about the role of the European Central Bank in preserving the euro. It is my judgment that Greece should stay in the euro if it can, and that it has been wise to make that choice, because I think the long-term benefit is real, and the long-term benefit also politically is real. And so I not only view this as a likely outcome, but the desirable one. I am assuming, for purposes of most of my talk, though I'll come back to it at the end, that there will be no new European Union recession or global recession. I admit that the U.S. Congress is doing everything it can to muck up those assumptions. It's interesting, the markets also don't take seriously the Tea Party. The markets are more or less stable or even up today. The U.S. is a little bit chaotic. It is not a role model. It is an example to avoid, unfortunately, right now. It does show that politics everywhere is very difficult because managing more difficult times is not easy in any political system. And for various reasons that I'll discuss, it's even harder now. But I do assume that we're not going to be in another major international crisis. If we are, as I'll say at the end, everything I'm saying will have to be reconsidered. I just want to be clear about it. I'm going to talk about Greece's policies in a context of the foreseeable future that is relatively gradually improving, rather than in the face of hard shocks. If there are more hard shocks, I hope I'll be invited back, unless I say so many stupid things, because then one would have to think about very different kinds of issues. My final assumption is that Greece can nurse itself back to health, largely through its domestic policies, but also through help from the outside. I don't think that this can be done purely by Greek action responsibility lies 3/4 on Greece, I would say, and 1/4 on the partners. Maybe the ambassador would like me to say 90%, 10%, but the truth is that the financial overhang that Greece faces is so serious that it does require forbearance by Greece's partners. It cannot be solved by itself. Greece is on a financial knife edge and is likely to remain on a financial knife edge for several years to come. So in this sense, this is not a circumstance where the fate is simply in Greek hands. It's also in Germany's hands. It's also in your partner's hands, but it's predominantly a Greek responsibility because Greece could be doing a lot more to achieve economic recovery. This is a country with vast talents and with vast resources, cultural, physical, human. And it's suffering from a high level of disorganization and lack of strategy. When so many people are unemployed, it's not only a macroeconomic phenomenon, it's a strategic set of issues as well. Greece has choices to make to use its young people better, or to find new markets, or to undertake new strategies for growth. And I believe that they exist. One thing that I think is wrong analytically right from the start is the idea that Europe is a closed system. So if Germany runs a surplus, someone else has to run a deficit. And that because of that, some people say, well, Germany has to reduce its trade surplus, for example, to make room for Greece's exports. This is more or less silly for a world economy. Europe is not a closed system. Greece's options are not only to sell to Germany or to the European Union. Indeed, your most important markets are probably outside the European Union. Many of them you ignore, like the Middle East, which is as rich as can be, flooded with oil money, building like crazy, but not too many Greek construction firms doing the building. So I don't believe that this idea that Germany has to take expansionary policies so that Greece can recover. There's a big world out there. Greece is a very small part of it. And like great Greek heroes of the past, you have to go out and find the world. So you need your Greek explorers to go out and find the new markets. Some of them are quite close by. So this is not even distant exploration. And now there's GPS wherever you go. And, Odysseus could always call Penelope back home now. Say, I'm coming home, I'll take a quick trip home for the weekend, then I'll go back to Troy, or whatever. So it's a little easier now to explore the world. And this, I think, is one of the things that I feel is missing right now. Everybody waiting for what Germany does. But it doesn't add up that way. And many of my economics friends, people I like in journalism, write as if this is a closed system. But it's not a closed system. So whatever Germany does in its macro policy isn't so important for Greece. What it does in financial policy is a little bit more important. And that's a big difference that I want to explain. Okay, the history we know, kind of, and I won't say too much about it, except to say that Greece borrowed a lot. With your friends at Goldman Sachs and others, you hid how much you borrowed at various times. This all became revealed when the sudden stop of the global financial system took place. German banks were part of the irresponsibility, by the way. There is no debt crisis without irresponsibility, both of creditors and debtors. This is one of the most basic lessons of a market that has two sides to it. But when the crisis hit, Greece was borrowing very heavily and had run up a massive debt, and because of the sudden stop, had a sharp collapse of the economy and a sharp rise of interest rates. Also, mistakes by your partners that put interest rates very high, so there was another wave of building up the debt. So by the time the dust had settled, all of a sudden, Greece has this mountain of debt. And you can state this mountain in a variety of ways. The public debt is one way, and that can be stated as net and gross assets, or the nation's debt to external creditors, or the bad loans on the banks. They're all, of course, interconnected. There is a mountain of debt that is very hard to pay off. Some of it can't be paid off. Many enterprises will not be able to pay off their bad loans. The banks will have to write down a lot of bad loans. There will have to be debt to equity conversions and financial workouts. But the point is, you have what is classically known as a debt overhang. And it's a pretty serious one. It's so serious that Greece is on the edge of realistically being able to service this debt. The boundary condition is not the sheer physical ability, it's the social instability limits of the debt. And I wouldn't say that 160% of GDP of public debt, most of which is owned outside, is an easy level of debt to manage. But it is probably manageable, is the point. I made up some numbers 10 minutes ago. These are not meant to be taken all that seriously, but with a little spreadsheet, you can be as good as the Troika in an hour. Every school child should know how to do this so that the IMF and the European Central Bank and everybody doesn't amaze you. You put in the growth rate, the real interest rate, the debt levels, the primary surplus, and lo and behold, you can make any calculations you want. It took me 10 minutes. It's not so hard to do. So here's an example. If Greece has its public debt restructured at low real interest rates, but still higher, say, than German interest rates, and if there's a real growth recovery, which is the main point that I want to talk about, because I think there should be a real recovery, not only in a moral sense, but in a practical sense. I don't see the barriers exactly. And if there is a sizable budget surplus, and you're almost there, by the way, it's been very painful, but Greece has a budget surplus now, primary budget surplus, not an overall budget surplus. Then what is now 160% of GDP could decline very sharply, in my little example, to 76% of GDP in 2030 and 34% of GDP in 2040. Is this absurd or is this realistic? We don't really know. The interest rate depends on your partners because they're your creditors. So this is where there's international responsibility. The German Finance Ministry, Brussels, the European Central Bank, the IMF have to take a very realistic view of Greece's public finances and its exposure. And I believe has to restructure that debt. I'm not talking about canceling the debt, I'm talking about putting the interest rates at reasonable levels over a long period of time. Then Greece would have to do two things in addition to that, neither of which is easy. One is to run primary surpluses for quite a while to actually service this debt. And second, to grow. Those are both possible. Neither is easy. I would say Germany's not going to give you a much better deal than this. I will argue later on, maybe it should, maybe it shouldn't, but I don't think it's going to. That's just my friendly advice. You can try. I might even try to help you, but I doubt it would work. Given that, it really behooves us to ask the question, can Greece grow? If Greece can't grow, this whole bet is off. if all that's in store is years more of a declining economy and high unemployment, absolutely I would not support this scenario at all. I think people really do have to understand what it means to have a quarter of the workforce unemployed. It's a social catastrophe for this country. And to have more than half of young people without jobs and leaving the country is a social catastrophe for this country. It's not normal. It's not, well, okay, things will eventually work out. It is, in this case, at the scale of the Great Depression. The big difference for Greece, though, is that we're not living in a world depression. We're actually living in a growing world economy, and Greece can take advantage of that. This is not 1930, or as Paul Krugman keeps saying, he thinks it's 1937. That's nonsense. In the Great Depression, the whole world was in crisis. The whole world is not in crisis right now. Greece is in crisis. If the whole world is in crisis, I need a different PowerPoint. Because my remarks are premised on the idea that Greece has markets, and you can go win those markets. And as business people, you know how to do that also. So I want to talk about resetting growth in Greece. It's obvious at two levels. Greece has to do two really fundamental things. One, it needs to grow the exports. Surprisingly, this has not happened yet. Of all the countries in deep crisis, Greece is doing the worst. Your exports are just stagnant. I understand they're starting to turn up gradually. I do not believe that's just the fault of international constraints. I believe that it is also a lack of effort of the government in focus on export promotion, which has a targeted set of tools. But Greece's success now will not come from internal demand recovery. Nobody's going to let you do that. Neither your consumers nor anyone else is going to boost the domestic demand enough for domestic-led recovery. You're not going to have fiscal stimulus. I don't even believe in it, by the way. But even if I did believe in it, I tell you there's no way you're going to get it. Your recovery will have to come through export-led growth, which is fine because Greece is a small, open economy with a world out there that doesn't know it fully but wants to buy Greek goods and services. And so that's how the recovery has to come. The sectors are maybe not fully obvious because I'm sure you could tell me good stories of new surprising sectors that have at least some green shoots. But tourism can continue to grow, agro-industry can continue to export. I believe Greece should be constructing a lot in the Middle East, even in Turkey, in North Africa, not simplest environments, but you know this part of the world very well. And Greece has a lot of good construction firms which are basically without any business in the internal market right now. And construction services internationally are an absolutely valid form of exports. Greece has huge renewable energy, of course. Solar and wind power, among other potential energy sources. That requires a lot of organization to export, and that won't happen in 2 years, but it could be big business in 10 years, and should be. And Germany needs that energy. Germany's Energiewende is not working very well right now, because if you go to Berlin in March or April, as I did this time, it was snowfall. It was dark, and there was no solar power being produced at all. But at the same time, Athens had sunshine. And so the idea of a grid that is a regional grid for solar and wind power is a very strong logical possibility. It requires the transmission interconnections, which don't exist yet. Greece could be exporting health services. This is, of course, one of the healthiest places in the world and one of the longest life expectancy. And you own the most famous diet in the whole world, the Mediterranean diet. So, and the most beautiful islands, I would say, in the whole world. So people should come here paying a lot of money for health visits. Just another example. The IT sector has a lot of expertise, especially among young Greek engineers. Greece could be exporting international higher education services. This is becoming a big business. This is a place that students would want to come all over the world. Yesterday when we were in the Vatican, my wife will tell you I wanted to do one thing, and that was run to see Raphael's The School of Athens, because it's my favorite painting. And I needed to enjoy looking at Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato again. You've got a good grant. You know, the School of Athens is really a good grant. And it is potential to attract students from all over the world to the University of Athens and to other institutions of higher education here. And if I were a student, that's where I would come. So I think that this is another example. Obviously, Greece remains one of the world leaders in shipping and increasingly in logistics. And I'm very excited by China's role in the port because I think that's very significant for Greece and for Europe. And it means that Greece, as a transit point for merchandise, for people, for tourism, for pipelines, for renewable energy is very, very strong. The location is good in the sense that it's interconnected. That's what's made Greek history so complicated for millennia, because you're right in the middle of things. But that is good from the point of view of trade and logistics. So, next point. Exports don't happen by themselves. I don't know how many trade missions the Prime Minister has taken. I hope every month the Prime Minister is taking you business people around the world, visiting countries to promote Greek exports. Is that what's happening? Okay. So this is a basic tool. It means that a head of state comes with 50 business people and visits a potential market and signs some agreements with the counterpart head of state, and the business people discuss and identify areas for business. And it seems to me that this is just one of many tools that's extremely basic, but my view is underutilized in this country. Export zones. Greece is a platform for production. China is looking for a European platform for lots of manufacturing into Europe. Greece is natural with the port facilities and so forth. It's a matter of structuring the arrangements in special export conditions, even physical zones as well as export promotion activities. And of course, trade financing has collapsed in the last 5 years. And so businesses can't get trade financing. But this is where I would look like a laser beam. It's not a normal situation. If Greece is going to earn its way out of this crisis, as its creditors are requiring, it has to have the space to earn its way out. And so these tools need to be very consciously developed. Greece needs thousands of startup companies. And that requires tax treatment and financial arrangements and regulatory arrangements that give favor to these startups. Of course, inside the economy, Greece suffers from a pervasive debt overhang of every kind. This is very tricky to handle because the banks are in trouble, the NPLs are massive, the corporate sector has massive NPLs, and the Greek government owes this massive amount to external creditors. What do you do with that? When a debt overhang is badly handled, it leads to liquidation. It leads to the cessation of business. When a debt overhang is properly handled with financial engineering, then companies that are profitable except for the debt overhang in one way or another continue their operation, but perhaps with restructured ownership. Perhaps the debt is converted to equity, but the enterprise continues rather than being liquidated. So Greece has a lot of financial engineering to do, not just in the banks, but in the corporate sector. Of course, this is painful. It means a change of ownership, but it also means the continuation of enterprise. We face that in the U.S. automobile sector. The automobile companies were bankrupt. I strongly favored a bailout of those companies in 2008. I alerted President Obama when he was campaigning that this would be first on his agenda. And what happened with the auto sector was there was this mass liquidated, the debt was converted to equity. There was a lot of politics involved. It was a little bit ugly. I think some of the tricks that were used were not great myself. But in any event, the companies are now making money, and they're going forward. And this has to happen all over this economy, actually. For the existing enterprises, there has to be a restructuring of the balance sheets to get the debt burdens down. Not to liquidate the companies, but to restructure the balance sheets. Liquidation means unemployment. And many of the companies that have high debt ratios are utterly viable, but they inherit the shocks of the last decade. So good financial engineering to clean up the balance sheets is another part of the growth strategy. Then, as I've emphasized, new directions of trade. If you look at where Greece trades right now, it's very traditional. You trade with Italy, you trade with Turkey, you trade with Germany, you trade in the immediate neighborhood. The amount of trade in the Middle East is tiny, actually. I was shocked by it. Saudi Arabia is not even on the top 20, I think, of trade partners. Maybe that's wrong, but it's very, very small. UAE was the only one that appeared on the list that I looked at, and it appeared at something like 17th place. The Middle East is a gusher of money. If you want to know where all the money in the world is, it's there. They're selling a lot of oil at $108 a barrel. They're building a lot of buildings. They're buying a lot of goods. They need a lot of agricultural products. They are a food importing region. So it seems to me this is a tremendous market very close by. And of course, Greece has not really made East Asia a market, almost at all. Of course, now your relations with China are becoming stronger, but Greece's ability to export to China is much, much stronger than has shown up so far. And with China so interested in Greece, that may be the best place to take your first trade promotion mission. They're very good at signing deals, large deals. Tax policy. This is complicated. But Greece needs tax revenues, but it also needs not to break the growth process. So it needs special tax policies, in my view, for startup companies. It needs tax policies to favor youth employment. It probably needs to reduce corporate tax rates and raise other taxes. This is not the way I'd like the world to work, by the way, because this is a little bit of a race to the bottom, that every country is reducing its corporate tax rates to try to attract FDI. And it's not very good because every government around the world is crying for revenues right now. But from Greece's perspective, I would cut the corporate tax rates and promote FDI. But you can't do that without balancing it through VAT or other means, and property and wealth taxes also, to make it somehow viable socially as well as economically. But lowering the rate of taxation on new investments, new capital formation, new firms is important. And attracting FDI requires a competitive tax policy as well. Mobile capital really looks at the tax rates, and you've got a lot of competitors at lower tax rates. Direct youth employment policies. Clearly, this is an area where Germany has excelled. Germany has figured out the secret that no one else has figured out of how to move young people effectively from school to work. And of course, I don't think any of us is going to be able to replicate institutions that are 100+ years old. But I think we can learn from Germany that active labor market policies, including apprenticeships and training programs, are very important. And since there's a lot of the largest businesses in this country in the room, I think that this is something where the business community needs to come forward and then look to the government, and maybe the government look to Brussels also and say, here's how we could open up 50, 100,000 apprenticeship positions quickly and do training. But here's what we would need in order to be able to finance that. But I don't have the numbers in my mind, but it should be an initiative of the business community to say, we see the high youth unemployment. Young people do not have the skills we need, but they can be trained. And then government has a role to play in helping to co-finance that. There could be no payroll taxes paid for young workers, or no payroll taxes paid on new employment up to a certain number of months. Of course, Greece needs more labor market flexibility, especially for young people, because having rigid labor market policies and 60% unemployment of youth is a disaster. And so there needs to be a way to get young people into actual jobs. Every country needs technology policies. This is one of the key ways that countries compete. And Greece, of course, has many areas of high technology. Energy is one sector, information technology, agronomics, and I'm sure there are others. A technology policy requires an integrated strategy of public funding for science, university engagement, venture capital, and attracting high-tech companies to Greece through favorable conditions for infrastructure and taxation. But this is also part of Greece's future, is creating technology hubs in a few key areas. And that does not happen by itself. That's part of the toolkit of economic growth. I looked at the most recent ranking of Greece in the World Competitiveness Report just a moment ago. Greece ranks 91, which is not good enough, of course, because for a high-income country in Europe, 91 is for a middle-income country in Asia. So Greece cannot keep its living standards and employment with competitiveness at 91. Now, it's quite interesting that on many categories, Greece ranks much, much better, of course. In infrastructure, 38, in health and primary education, 35, in higher education, 41, in technology readiness, 39, in market size, 47. That means, to my mind, that Greece could advance 25 rungs in the competitiveness rankings within the next 5 years. Because these are the hard things. Greece has done the hard stuff. You have an educated population, you have the infrastructure, you have good health, you have good technological readiness. So what's wrong? Well, these are things we know about. One, institutions. What does that mean? It means that the respondents to this survey don't trust the government to carry out consistent policies. Macro, that is the debt crisis. I don't have to review that. The goods market, and the main thing wrong in the goods market, according to the survey data, was poor conditions for startup businesses in Greece. And labor markets, very bad. Very low flexibility, of course. And this is part of the reason why Greece doesn't have a supply response in the export sector. There's no shortage of aggregate demand for Greece. This is the point I want to make. There's $90 billion of world aggregate demand out there. 90 trillion, excuse me. There's no aggregate demand issue. All of this stuff about austerity, Keynesian, and so forth, this is wrong. There's plenty of demand for Greece. It's just not inside, it's outside. Incomes inside are low. People are hurting. They have a lot of debt. But outside is the market. But if you don't have a supply response, you don't get the response. And finally is finance, of course, which is the European crisis and still the lack of resolution of the banking sector. What should the rest of Europe do? Most importantly, I would say to consolidate Greece's public debt at a low interest rate and long term. German interest rates for 30-year bonds is 2.6%. If Greece were refinanced for the long term in the public sector at 3.5%, the numbers work. This is what Europe should do. Doesn't have to cancel the debt. By the way, I'd probably prefer it, but if it isn't going to happen, at least the interest rates can be consolidated and the term structure can be lengthened considerably. Europe should create a special investment fund for youth employment, not only for Greece, but for Europe more generally. Europe should support an SME startup and growth fund. I guess it's called the Growth Institution. So it's the same idea. And finally, it's time for Europe to dream big again in terms of the future of Europe, especially in sustainable development. What I find odd, I must say, Germany is the leader, the thought leader, in getting to a low-carbon economy. Germany's taken a very bold decision, which I think the whole world should be grateful for, of moving to a low-carbon economy because we desperately need to head off the worst of climate change. And Greece is highly vulnerable to global climate change. But for this energy transition to work, Europe needs a European-wide strategy, not just a country-by-country strategy. So one thing that it urgently needs is a plan for an integrated grid that can connect power from all over Europe and even from North Africa and the Middle East into an integrated grid that can run on intermittent power sources that are at variable intensities in different parts of this overall grid. That would create a lot of jobs and a lot of dynamism and a lot of demand, if you will, and a lot of activity and an outlet for Greece's renewable energy as well. There are plans for this, but they don't go anywhere. And this, I think, is something that needs to be remedied as well. So Europe does have a lot to do. Everything I said up till now was about what Greece has to do. But Europe has to make sure that the financial conditions are tolerable. It's going to be a very steep slope up the mountain, without question. This is not an easy climb. It is a knife-edge climb. If things go wrong, the debt will be unpayable. It's nearly so. But you can just find the path forward, and it's worth taking that path. But Europe has to help make sure that that path exists, and that's something that Greece can't do on its own. Finally, contingency planning. Everything I've said is for a normal world. We can't be sure that the world will be normal. It has not been normal in recent times. What I have said only applies if the external conditions are adequate. Because if there's a global crisis, Greece does not have to sacrifice itself through mindless debt servicing in the context of a global crisis. Call me back, I'll help you default. It is not the recommended path, but we all wish that Bruning had done it in 1930. Rather than trying to pay off the World War I debts and to show the world that Germany was determined to pay the debts and ended up leading to a catastrophe. There are times when you don't have to walk all the way to a catastrophe. So I'm counting on the world to be normal, but if it's not normal, then you have to reconsider. If the Eurozone goes into another deep recession, these numbers do not work. If China stops growing, God help us, then it's back to the Vatican. Because China is absolutely part of the bulwark of global growth. If the Eurozone banking crisis worsens, for example, because Italy can't keep its government together because some octogenarian or another won't let go and should be in jail, I don't know who, that's another matter. If there's a global downturn, it doesn't work. So in all of those cases, more radical measures would be needed. But fortunately, this evening, we don't have to contemplate them. Thank you very much.
We would like to thank Professor Jeffrey Sachs for his very insightful presentation. And now we're going to open it to questions